Hello and welcome to Risking It All with me, your host, Jake Martens, for another episode, the third installment, in fact. And I've been taking a lot of stick today for wearing a shirt. Apparently, I'm usually quite a casual guy and I look overly smart. Every single employee I've spoken to today has told me that I look abnormally smart. But I'm glad to see that I've matched my attire with our guest today, who not only shares my button-down shirt today, but also my name. So I'm speaking today to Jake Martens, who has held a number of CISO roles, a number of advisory roles, and has had more roles than I've had years probably in the industry, and a significant amount of experience. We're going to talk about all things gaming, gambling, security around it, current events, his career, the world of the CISO, how it's changed, and everything else in between. So without further ado, let's bring him on and get on with it. Jake, thank you for joining me, for taking the time today. I appreciate you being with us.
You bet. And thanks for already acknowledging my attire. I appreciate that.
No, it's a lot. I wear a shirt so rarely that literally every person I spoke to at work today has said, you look unusually smart today. And I finally realized that it was all along. It was like a symbiotic thought process around the button-down shirts. But yours is a bit more daring and better than mine, if I'm going to be honest. But yours have more sunshine behind you than I do.
That's
so
fair.
That also makes sense.
I do find if I have buttons that go beyond here, I get some allergic reaction. So I got to stick to the polos.
Oh, there you go. There you go. So thank you again for joining us. Thanks for taking the time. You're out in St. George, Utah, right?
Correct.
And a bright and sunny day, it looks like, behind you.
Yeah, should be something close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit today here in St. George.
Well, it is not the same in the UK. I can tell you with a large degree of confidence. It was about 37 degrees today at times, so a little bit chilly. I was running this morning and I saw frost for the first time. But so are the differences in our lives. So I think I made you aware, but we kind of have the same start and end, and then the sandwich is whatever we put in between it. But I always start by asking you to introduce yourself, then to tell me who your hero is in life. It can be anybody. If you've listened to mine is Alexander Hamilton. I talk about a lot. What your hobby is, and the biggest risk you've ever taken. So go, take it away. Tell me about yourself.
Wow. Well, thanks for having me, Jake. It's my pleasure for sure. So nice to meet everyone. Jake Martens. Just left as the CISO of Aristocrat, a gaming company, which I think we'll talk a little bit about. Spent my life in various CISO roles, as Jake said, and kind of started my career in big tech with about 20 years at Hewlett Packard and a spinoff of HP, and then about a half a dozen years at Oracle before jumping into really my favorite role, which is that of the CISO. As Jake said, I live in St. George, Utah. I was kind of raised all over the place. My dad was in the Air Force, so that helped me kind of appreciate and hone my focus on relationships and our personal skills and those kinds of things, which have served me well. 3 kids, 1 grandson, 2 more grandkids on the way. And yeah, just my pleasure to be here. Okay, in terms of your first questions, my hero has to be my father. Not only the person I initially looked up to and idolized and continue to look up to and idolize, but somebody who really taught me a lot about humility. When I think I saw him make some of his first major mistakes, it taught me that heroes can be fallible. Heroes can make mistakes, and we can still put those people on the pedestal as our heroes, and in fact gives us that license to make mistakes ourselves. Hobbies has to be golf for me. I wish I was much better at it, but I love to play the sport, if you can call it that. In fact, here a half mile from my house in St. George, Utah, over the weekend was the Black Desert Championship, the first PGA Tour event in Utah in the last 60 or 65 years, something like that. So I get a chance to see some professional golfers, play a little golf this weekend as well. That would certainly be my hobby. What was the third part of that, Jake?
Hero, hobby, and the biggest risk you've ever taken in life.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe it'll be a little controversial. I think the biggest risk, maybe there's sort of a bookended risk. The first one I would say, I got married at 20 years old to my high school sweetheart. She's the mother of my 3 kids, and obviously co-grandparent of my grandson. So that was definitely a major risk. That marriage lasted a couple of decades, and I would say that the next biggest risk that I took was ending that marriage to kind of move on to a new phase. Both of those, I think, have panned out in the right way. But I think from a personal standpoint, that would be the biggest risk that I took. I think professionally, pivoting from IT into cybersecurity was probably the biggest risk at that point in time, a couple of decades ago, coming kind of up through the application side of IT, some of the early days of AppSec, and then deciding to pivot into cybersecurity when others were kind of scratching their head at that decision. Probably the biggest risk professionally that I've ever taken.
Thanks. I'm going to dig on a couple of those. I would say I'm going off piece, but I don't usually start on piece. So we'll go straight into the deep powder. But you touched on a couple of things there that I think are very vulnerable, right? You talked about marriages and relationships and the idea of starting and also ending them. You talked about the fallibility of people and the fact that we make mistakes. Do you think that people in our role, often who speak in kind of public personas, don't have vulnerabilities enough? That we don't talk about the things that we did wrong, or the things we wish we'd done different, or the things that are hard but we did right?
I think there's no question about it, and hopefully those things are changing. But I think it's easy to talk about success, and it's hard to talk about failure. And yet, if I think about the things that have truly shaped my career and shaped my life, it's probably equal parts of both. You don't get the success without taking risks, and you don't get to success without many failures along the way. So I think we should embrace more of those. I think we should be more vulnerable. Personally, take off the mask and sort of cut through the veneer, and be willing to take risks and be willing to fail.
Yeah, I agree. And then you talked at the end about switching from IT to security, which I think was a trend that happened a while ago, but is less so now. But I want to actually touch on a different point you made. So what was you spent a long time in big tech, like between it, like 25 years nearly, right?
Yep.
Between 2 or 3 companies? The
Yeah,
world's
almost 20
changed,
years
right?
at HP and Agilent, and then a half dozen at Oracle, so nearly 25 years. Yeah.
And you look now at kind of a much more agile, kind of shorter role that we all see in our world, and the CISO role particularly being shorter. How's that been for you culturally? Do you prefer the modern way? Do you go back to the days where you picked up your paycheck and it was just a logo on the brand? Like, what do you like and why?
Yeah, it's really fascinating to think about, when I was at HP and it was, still a lot of people thinking about and talking about, beginning and ending a career at the same place. And you look now at how different it is. I think there's something really powerful about making a move from one company to another, getting out of the way of somebody who you've, hopefully groomed as a successor, or somebody waiting in the wings to take your role and perhaps do it better, probably in my case, do it better. And yet there's that, that sort of comfort of being in a place and knowing all the people and all the history and all the things going on, all the acronyms and on and on. But I really wouldn't change the pivot that I've made, and I really wouldn't recommend to anybody to stay in one place. Certainly you can change roles within a company, and I think at the very least folks should do that. But there's just something very powerful and rewarding and confidence building about going to a place where literally nothing and starting from scratch and trying to claw your way to an understanding of what happened yesterday and who you're talking to and what's coming next. And I don't know what the right timing is there. It maybe depends on the role and the person and the company. But certainly every few years, I found it very refreshing to go and do something else and prove to myself that I can and get out of the way of somebody else who can come in behind me and do a great job.
I think there's partly different mentalities, right? I know that I recognize in my life, I'm a builder and a scaler. I don't like the absolute from scratch stage, but I like when you've got something built to build and scale it as big as it can kind of get to. And then I'm like, kind of bored now. I want challenges again. I want like the hard bit where you build it. But other people come in and go, I love like just taking a mature program and making it sing. I think that's kind of where, and you sound like you're kind of in between, right? You kind of have had that world where you've kind of sat and managed an existing and a functional program, but you also like the kind of get your hands dirty and get involved in things.
I think that's right. I really think I'm kind of the transformational leader, and the great news is there's plenty of transformation needed in cyber across the world.
Amen.
Whether that's from terrible to good, which I've seen, or whether that's from good to great, which I've also seen. I'm similar. I love the idea of scaling. I love the idea of really trying to come in and take something to an exceptionally differentiated level. But I'm pretty decent at coming into a place that's a bit behind where it needs to be, and focusing on people first, and focusing on process second, and focusing on technology third to really transform to a place of stability.
No, that makes sense. Look, we were talking before we came on air about CISOs and their role, and I think this year has been a transformational, to con your word you just used, year for the CISO. Like, I think I've seen more and more friends of mine from CISO communities who've been out of work multiple times, who are fantastic individuals, people who have changed, like myself, and gone from field to CISO, or in reverse, and going to more go-to-market roles. I've seen a lot of advisory capacities. I have a couple myself. I've seen more of the kind of fractional stuff, the venture capitalist stuff. Like, where's your head on that? Do you think this is good? Do you think this is distracting from what we're all supposed to do? Like, what do you think about the way that the role is evolving? And also, tagging on to the question on the back of that is, why are we suddenly going in this wild shift from massive gap in employment, apparently, to suddenly people out of work? So I guess 2 questions. Is the change in diversity good? And is it caused by, or causing, this sudden problem that we have where there's actually more CISOs than jobs, apparently?
Yeah, it's a really good couple of questions. I think it's a very positive thing to see the evolution of the CISO role. And I think what it signals is that, cybersecurity can't just be something that a cyber leader and a cyber team does within a company or within the world, right? It needs to be something that everybody is leaning into. Everyone needs to understand why this stuff matters and what they need to do to behave securely and influence the world to a better place. I love the connection between cyber leadership and the enterprise. I love the connection between cyber leadership and kind of the product or game side of things in the gaming industry. If I think about where I go from here from a next role perspective, I think you laid out a number of the different options, and yet I'm not sure it's a question of or. I think it's a question of the combination of a role that influences the enterprise and its cyber DNA, a role that influences the product and its evolution to a more secure and resilient place. Connecting and advising to venture capital and portfolio companies, looking at folks that need and can't maybe afford full-time cyber leadership help. So how do you help from a fractional perspective? And eventually, I think you'll see more and more CISOs in the actual boardroom as a director within public companies, to be sure. So I think it's a positive thing and an evolution of the influence and importance that cybersecurity represents in the world and in companies today. And your second question, say it again.
So I think the second one is probably disparate from the first one. I don't know why I typed them together, but we talked a long time about this skills shortage, right? The fact there's trillions of jobs, apparently, the amount of cybersecurity professionals out there. And then suddenly there's not. This year, I know lots of people in junior positions asking me to help them find work. I know senior CISOs who have gone through 2 or 3 gigs this year. Suddenly it doesn't seem like there is a trillion jobs. Like, what happened? What changed? I've asked a lot of people this question, so I'm always curious what the response is.
Yeah, I think, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have within cyber today, is this dichotomy of the labor market. Millions of cyber jobs, and yet they all seem to be sort of squarely in the middle part of the life cycle or of the career, sort of spectrum. I get pinged all the time from entry level folks who are trying to make their way into cyber and can't find that foothold, right? That they don't have years of experience. Obviously, they're entry level. And on the other side of it, I think there are many folks in senior cyber leadership roles who are trying to find their next role and land something with the right influence and impact and compensation and these kinds of things. So I think it's a huge challenge to figure out as employed cyber leaders, how do you craft roles that really will get people in the door, and some non-traditional folks coming from IT or other parts of the world, not technical at all, perhaps into GRC roles or into risk roles or into BISO roles, and then how do we, from a cyber leadership standpoint, figure out how to influence other places and take our next CISO role, or perhaps, as we just talked about, be comfortable with other kinds of influence roles that maybe aren't CISO in title. It's an interesting evolution. I think maybe partly related to the sort of post-COVID world, maybe partly related to a little bit of the overall economy. But to see where it goes from here is going to be fascinating.
Do you think that diversity of background is part of the problem? Because I know that, like, for me, I got to a point where I was hiring and someone said, what do you need for the credentials in this role? And I said, I don't really know. Like, they might be pen testers, they might come from a GLC background, they might be IT audit backgrounds, they might be IT professionals. And eventually got to the point where I said, look, here is the guy that I've currently got enrolled who I want to promote. He's very good. Go find me someone like him. I don't know what it means, but find me him.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and even if you look at the CISO roles and the number of folks who have come up through infrastructure, I think continue to outnumber the folks like myself who came up through more of the application side of things. And yet both have, I think, value to add. And obviously my challenge is to extend my technical understanding and depth within more of the infrastructure and network spaces, and some of the network and infrastructure folks extending into applications and connecting with users and this kind of thing. It's a really interesting point, but some of the most successful people that I've seen have come up through some of the most innocuous kinds of industries and roles, hospital administration and marketing, and pivoting those folks into cybersecurity to think about things entirely differently. I like the idea of saying, this is the role I need. I'm not quite sure how to get there, but if you get a good talent acquisition team, you get a good set of referrals. I really think you find the right wiring and the right way of looking at the world, some of the right core raw skills. It doesn't matter if these people are currently cyber or not. In fact, in many cases, it's better that they're not.
No, I agree. I think that to anyone listening who's in the recruitment world, I think cyber is probably the best place for recruitment in the next few years. I think that our industry is so nuanced in its recruitment that AI is never going to replace the ability for you to actually apply skill, experience, and knowledge, because you simply can't say, here are the qualified credentials must have. It's not like hiring an AE or hiring an accountant who have a set number of qualifications and background roles that you want to see. This could be anything. I agree. I'm fully for the fact that I think some of the best people I've seen who come with fresh eyes came from nothing remotely related even to technology. I think there's an interesting point that I think actually Simon raised about the idea of it. I don't know if this translates into the US, but in the UK we have apprenticeships where rather than going to college, people will actually go straight into effectively like a kind of working placement. They'll do 3 to 5 years and they'll learn the job as they're paid on like a smaller wage to be put through various qualifications, education, etc. I think that's a good thing for our industry. Give people this broad set where they learn, like you hinted it, right? You said app and infra. Well, I came from a pen testing background, from an offensive security. Maybe everyone needs exposure to all these areas to some degree as part of a structured path to give someone this holistic outlook. I don't know if we're going to solve this problem, but anyway, it's of interest. So I'd like to jump from this point to a few current events. I'll give you the option on this one. Someone brought up earlier talking about the Snowflake ID breach. Is it something you want to talk about, or is it not? You have the choice.
No, I think not on that one.
Cool, good. I think it was John Bell. Don't worry, I will bring it up next week when I talk to Adam, and we'll talk about it then, because I know that he will be interested in this topic. So I'm quite happy to punt it. Join next week. Let's go into a few things that I thought were interesting. So NIST password policy changes, right? 2 main things they've done: got rid of rotation, because all that most people did was add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 to the end. And they've got rid of complexity in favor of saying, write some kind of long phrase. Positive or negative, or just another NIST change for the sake of changing things?
I don't know. I would probably put it in the category of just another change. It's been more than 2 decades since the initial prediction of the death of the password, and yet it's still here. I think it's slowly evolving in the right direction, being led by obviously giant tech companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, and others. Certainly it'll be around, the password will be around long after I'm not on this world. But I take it as sort of another evolution there. I agree with the changes. I think obviously the world needs to be about biometrics and MFA and on, but the password is going to be here for quite some time. I think this evolution is just a natural way to sort of prevent some of the nonsense that we've continued to see, to your point, where it's simply changing from 1 to 2 and pretending like you're more secure today than you were yesterday.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I'm kind of in the same place where I'm like, I think there's some progress in it, but I still think like it needs to take a jump to say, well, actually, we don't suggest passwords at all. We suggest MFA as de facto in all places, and we suggest biometrics as being part of the composition of that MFA in by de facto in all places. I think we're slowly going that way, but NIST is a bit too scared to say anything too revolutionary because they're a government entity. But next one I think is interesting: critical infrastructure. So NIST 2, not confused with NIST, coming out in the EU is around the protection of critical infrastructure. And I don't want to go into European cybersecurity laws, but there's obviously been a few attacks in the US in the last few years. There was one on water infrastructure not long ago. There was the oil pipeline. There's been a few. Do you think that we're doing enough as cybersecurity? And you talked before we came online about talking with some government agencies and entities. Do you think we're doing enough to actually protect the stuff that really matters versus like spending our time with like social media platforms to like, are we doing the right, are we protecting the right things at a government level rather than just trying to find Zuckerberg more money to protect what really matters and what the future of warfare potentially is? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, critical infrastructure, whether utilities, healthcare, trucking, on and on, are just dramatically attractive targets for those wishing to do us harm, wishing to cash in financially, and obviously from and by people without any morals. But I think, like any industry, except maybe on massive steroids, organizations in critical infrastructure have to prioritize investments in cyber. Going from scary to stable takes years, and I think most governments and most of the organizations in critical infrastructure are investing in these areas, and probably very few of them are firmly with their head in the sand. But yeah, I mean, I think the direct answer is no, we're not doing enough. No, we have to go faster. Yes, we need to invest more. But it's a tough thing, especially in government and quasi government, where you've got even tighter budgets and more regulation and more approval levels and these kinds of things. But I think we've just got to do more and recognize that even those of us in non-critical infrastructure need to be leaning into the topic and helping people understand and keep it on the frontal lobe rather than the back of our minds.
Okay, last one. Read a story yesterday about robot vacuums. You might have seen it, and the fact that they're actually watching people, and the privacy concerns of the recorded video of robot vacuums. And it plays with the whole same thesis that Alexa's listening to us and the phones are listening to us, and every piece of smart home tech is just reporting back our every move, thought, and desire to marketeers and or the government. What do you think? It's a completely open question. What are your thoughts on this? Because I have a lot of thoughts, but I want to see what other people's are before I say anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we all need to be caring about. We all need to be informed about the risks, the ways to mitigate. I think we all need to be taking seriously the need to embrace both individual responsibility on these devices that we're electing to put into our homes and into our lives, and we need to be not shying away from embracing government regulations around it as well. How much of each of those elements becomes deeply personal, even political, I think, but undoubtedly requires aspects of each of those. And I think if we as individuals are prioritizing, if we as individuals are taking personal responsibility, and if we as individuals are not polarizing the government regulation piece of this, I think we'll find our way through. But it's certainly a scary thing to read about, and how many people just plug devices in and or use these devices without either appreciating or even configuring them is really pretty scary.
It made a lot of people in the offensive space or historically offensive space like me go and think, I wonder if I can compromise my mother-in-law's vacuum and film her for the day and then send it back to her, start talking to her while she's there in the morning. Gave me all kinds of weird, crazy ideas. Again, if there's any questions, feel free to ask, but we'll pivot into gaming, so that's an area that's interesting to me. I've seen a lot of movement in cyber in the gaming space in recent months, particularly this year. I think there's a massive rise in popularity, both in traditional physical bricks and mortar gaming, but also online gaming, gambling, etc. What makes it different? You've been a CISO in those companies. What are the challenges? What makes it harder? What makes it easier? Like, how does it compare to other roles you've held, and why?
Yeah, and gaming has a wide spectrum as well, right? In Aristocrat, where I was most recently, you've got half of the business online games, increasingly in the real money space, and half of the business in physical slot machines placed on casino floors. I think there's certainly a lot of similarities in terms of protecting the enterprise. I think there's certainly some similarities from a tech and product perspective, but probably some of the bigger differences people may not realize, but certainly in the gaming space, there's a lot of regulation, a lot of compliance. Arguably, depending on who you ask, more than finance and healthcare. Hundreds of different jurisdictions that are involved, and navigating those and influencing those from a cyber perspective is critical. I think also, again, different on kind of both ends of that spectrum. In one case, you have a very managed, well-controlled endpoint on a segmented network put on a casino floor. The other, it's the Wild West of mobile phones and PCs in terms of endpoints and networks. So trying to help influence those from a tech stack perspective, or from a protect the player and responsible gaming perspective is certainly very, very tricky. I think also, just to kind of dive into that point a little further, is one of the differences, while every industry has its fair share of partnerships and supply chain connections, the partnership between the tech manufacturer of a slot machine, the regulatory testing body that's helping ensure that it's operating in the right way, and the casino operator that runs that slot machine on the floor, and navigating, proactive, reactive, and the ongoing monitoring in between it certainly does take a village in that space. So something a bit different from a cyber perspective. Similarly, on the mobile game side, you've got the tech provider, you've got the Apple or Google Play Store. You've got various, payment card processing intermediaries, and again, navigating all of that from a cyber protection standpoint while monitoring and responding well. I think there are certainly some differences on the partnership side, certainly some differences on the kind of compliance and regulatory side. Fun for sure, but challenging to operate within from a cyber standpoint.
I guess a couple of questions. John, I'll ask you in the chat just to explain what you mean for formulas, so I can ask the questions. I'm not quite sure. Maybe I missed the bit that you were actually referring to, but just bring that back up again. And I think to Phil's comment, I agree that there's multiple breaches happening in this area, which is why I think it's an interesting topic to talk about, both in gaming and in gambling as well. If you look at either side, whether it's kind of computer gaming versus like kind of more traditional gaming. So the two things you touched on, Jane, I thought were interesting is, one is increased regulation. Is that because of geodiversity? Is it because often you're covering so many countries at once and so many different jurisdictions that have different gaming rules? And do those rules then have cyber implications for you, or is it just overarching kind of compliance requirements?
Yeah, it kind of depends. Some of the regulations are explicit to the casino operator. Some of the regulations are explicit to studios. Some of the regulations are more about the ecosystem, which includes the tech provider as well. It certainly connects to some of the geographic differences, but I think it's sort of the classic, complexity and challenge of government entities, whether local, state, or national. You're just going to get folks that have different perspectives on what should be required and what shouldn't be, right? Not unlike the privacy laws, where you start comparing GDPR and CCPA and other things. So there certainly are some core cyber requirements and controls that are somewhat consistent on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, and then there are some that are different. Every one of these set of compliance requirements have some component of cyber in them. So understanding, keeping track, complying, proving that compliance is a key part of what cyber organizations have to do within the gaming industry.
The other question I've got on that, and that all makes sense to me. Do you have to secure the physical assets? So as a CISO in a gaming company, you talk about slot machines. Is it your responsibility to ensure the slot machines themselves are secure as well? Because that's a whole different level of security I've never even thought about. Yeah,
it's certainly a shared responsibility. Absolutely, as the tech provider and developer of the tech stack, the physical cabinet, everything that goes into math models and on and on. We as the tech company are looking at protecting that, but we're not immune from or separated completely from putting that physical asset on a casino floor. Certainly there's contractual liability transfer to the operator, and they're running this within a segmented or air-gapped network, and I can't be responsible for their network configurations, and they can't be responsible for the physical security on the machine. But working together, we have to really make sure that it's compliant, it's secure, it's being monitored, and responded to when things happen. Obviously, we saw with the events with MGM last year, whether fact or fiction, it looked like the attackers were trying to do some things with the casino network and trying to do some things with, slot machine payouts and these kinds of things, which they were ultimately not successful with. But fascinating to think about that as an attack vector, and certainly with that directly in the crosshairs, it's a partnership, right?
Yeah, I mean, building off of that as well, maybe this is a slightly pointy question, but I always think in gaming, the companies I spoke to seem to have quite advanced tech stacks, right? You're very ready to go and probably quite significant cash reserves. Am I right in thinking that it's a place where actually you can kind of actually go and kind of do not what you want, but you can actually solve the problems that most CISOs sit there and go, I don't have the budget to do this. Do you have the wealth and the backing to say, if there's a problem, we can position a solution and fix it? Or am I being overly optimistic?
That's probably overly optimistic, but like anywhere, you're having to defend and justify budgets, and certainly you can lean on compliance requirements, and you can lean on what's best in class, and you can lean on other incidents in the world, and point to incidents in smaller incidents in your own front yard or backyard. It's a little bit overly simplistic, but certainly this is an area where I think most companies, not even just the most progressive companies, but most companies in this space recognize the risk and the existential challenge on the product side if you don't get it right all of the time. So yeah, I think it's probably a little bit overly optimistic, but certainly something that during COVID and even after COVID, there's a recognition of this stuff matters in cyber. It matters in gaming for sure.
Yeah, because you get hit and no one wants to put their money in your slot machines, right? John was asking a question around kind of traditional kind of breach severity calculation formulae, but it wasn't really, my question wasn't do you apply those? It was how complex do yours get? Because I'm assuming that like in traditional world, I can go and say, well, actually, I know that if the likelihood is this, the impact is this, then based on the breach or risk or threat being this, then there's a likelihood of it. I'm going to end up with this number, right, of value. But I can look at it quite simply contextually. Whereas his question is, do you use these formulas at all? But I guess mine is building on top of that. Do your formulas have to take into context the wildly facing range of like legal and regulatory penalties you'd have in multiple geos at the same time if any of these things went wrong? So therefore, it's a way bigger calc than this is being based on.
Yeah, it certainly does get tricky, which is why it's so important to be as proactive as possible. But certainly, if you took a fictitious scenario of a slot machine that you put in dozens or 100 jurisdictions and having a cyber issue with that, on the far extreme, you'd be talking about pulling those off of floors and having to deal with the ramifications and recertification and brand damage and those kinds of things, really ugly things to think about, which is why it's so important to be so proactive on this and obviously recognize that, again, that partnership with how casinos are running these these networks and these environments.
Yeah, so John, but to your question, I think yes, they do use severity calculations and formulae, but they're probably quite long in their context based on the fact of the amount of different regulatory or legal penalties in various geos they could have if anything went wrong. Question, so industry-wise, we talk about gaming, leading and lagging. What do you think the industry is good at versus other industries? What do you think they're not good at in our world, in the cyber kind of technology context?
Yeah. And to some extent, it's difficult because you've got tech companies and you've got retail companies and sort of different industries in the gaming industry itself. But I was really impressed from a what are we leading on perspective on really the cross organizational collaboration.
Interesting.
So thinking about not just how can we influence regulation and improve safety for players and the stability of machines and of games, but how do you raise that harbor for all boats kind of thing, and it was cool to see that collaboration. I hadn't seen that in other industries as much as I saw in gaming and was able to be a part of, and I'm really proud of that. I think also the one thing that I really saw from a leading perspective, we talked about staffing, and one thing we didn't go into is around diversity. But when I left Aristocrat, we were fully 50% women, and it's not about the metric as much as it is about the impact that metric has on results and on the ability to attract and and retain other diverse talent and the ability to connect with diversity internally and externally to the organization. And I was beginning to see that really across the gaming industry, I think more than I had seen when I got there. In terms of lagging, I think it's dependent on a company by company basis, but I think where you have that much regulation, it really becomes, quite challenging to navigate what you want to do as a CISO, which is focus on security and driving capability to a stable and then a differentiated level. At the same time, you've got to continually prove your capabilities to these regulators, and when you have such fractional regulatory bodies and the effort to go through the work of proving those controls, I think that gets to be a bit challenging for somebody in my seat.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating. I think I would have expected that compliance and regulations was a challenge. I think I also expected that you probably had some great points around kind of being leaders in various capabilities. Cross-functioning makes sense to me. Why do you think there's a better diversity? You think that's intentional? You said it was cross-industry, so it wasn't intentional in your hiring practices. Why do you think the industry has been more effective or successful in terms of hiring diversity inside of cyber?
It's a good question. I think it does take intentionality on building a candidate pool. It takes intentionality on the importance of connecting with other functions that have more diversity. It's a good question. I don't fully know. I think it's an area where you can look at demographics of cyber and IT, and certainly strongly dominated by men still. But you look at some of the demographics on gaming, and there's a pretty good balance between men and women. So I think it's partly affected by the gaming industry itself, and partly an intentionality among cyber and tech hiring managers.
Thanks. There's a whole few things here about breaches coming up into the chat. One around the risk or impact of an authorization token breach. So the idea of stealing someone's ID and making it perpetual and being able to therefore get access to data, I think is interesting. I think it's one of the probably common vectors seen inside of your industry, or common attack or threat vectors. That I know that Phil's talking about how many more gaming studios have been breached. So that's Insomniac. He's talking about Pokemon's Make a Game Free. Do you think that this industry is more targeted than any other? And if yes, do you think it's more targeted on well, from you, I can literally steal money, right? Whereas if I go and breach like Sony's or kind of Pokemon, it's probably less financially based and more kind of what I can do from a disruption, or like, I don't know, maybe I'm being far-fetched. I'm not a massive gamer myself, but
yeah, it's some of both for sure. And when I came into gaming, I asked some of the same questions, but there really is a pretty massive reputational and financial impact on even game cheats. Individuals who come into some of these games and are able to navigate their way to levels and characters and skins and weapons that they shouldn't be allowed to have, whereas others have had to spend the time and the money, frankly, to earn their way into those levels. That can be a massive word of mouth and clear set of impacts on even those games that are not dealing with real money. But definitely the risk vector changes dramatically when you're talking about playing for real money online, whether it's sports betting or whether it's casino games coming soon to a jurisdiction near you. And so it ups the ante, and you have to take it more seriously, to be sure. Yeah, and it's obviously how do you assess the risks? How do you put the levels of defense and depth in place? How do you actively monitor and quickly respond when things go wrong? So in some ways, it's very similar to normal security operations function, and in other ways, it gets to be a bit different, or a little bit more on steroids, as I said earlier. Is it more targeted than others? I think it's certainly more targeted than many. I think it's an area that's sadly attractive to folks looking to make an impact or to get rich quick. So it really comes down to taking it seriously, prioritizing it, and navigating the basics well, for sure, and monitoring closely.
When big things happen, is there like a reactive shift? Let's look at, you mentioned MGM earlier, right? Which I think is probably the biggest and most notable recent breach in gaming. In reaction to that, did a lot of things happen? Was there like a group forum of like CISOs in the gaming world to say, what have we learned from this and what do we all need to do tomorrow? Like how is the industry reacting to that kind of thing when it happens and as it happens?
Yeah, to some extent, on a company by company basis, we were quick to kind of rally around our friends at MGM and Caesars as well, and
Yeah.
and obviously um, engage with them because we had our machines on their floor and trying to understand what's happening and stay out of the way of what was obviously their event and not ours. But support at every turn, and I think that's a pretty cool thing about what I found of the gaming industry is that kind of we're all in it together feeling. And that's certainly what we did is we took a step back and said, here's what we know or believe to have had happened within these environments. What does it mean to a company like Aristocrat? How can we learn from and do better? And then absolutely, we have spent an inordinate amount of time as CISOs around the gaming industry, thinking about and applying lessons from that. And investing again in this kind of raising the hardware for all boats kind of thing. It's been interesting to see. You certainly wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy. You wouldn't trade the lessons and the improvements that we're going to see in gaming because of it.
Oh, definitely. I think we talked about at the beginning, maybe before we came online, about the kind of, we talked about it on here actually, how much you learn from the challenges or harder parts of your life. And I've been fortunate, I say in some ways, to be involved in a few incidents in my time, and they probably taught me more in a short period of time than I've learned from anything in long periods of time of doing things right. And I think that's very true. And I think it's also important as a community, not just in gaming, but as a wider CISO community, we get better at kind of wrapping the arms around people rather than pointing examples and saying, this is what you did wrong, or I wouldn't have done this, or he didn't do that. I think
I certainly would have more hair and fewer wrinkles had I not gone through the breaches and incidents and events that I have in my career. But I wouldn't be nearly as effective as I am from a leadership standpoint without them.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. One last question. You talked about regulation quite a bit at the beginning, and it's obviously I've worked in regulated spaces and in companies that help with regulation for quite a while. Do you find that a lot of the new regulations and the regulations in different geos bring in actually cyber specific parts of their regulations? And if they do they ever conflict? Like, are there points where you say you've got to do this, but this regulation, this geo says you've got to do this, and actually they're not just complementary, they're completely different?
Absolutely, they all have some cyber elements today, and increasingly that's the case. So again, some of them apply directly to operators, some of them apply to the tech side, some of them apply to the ecosystem. I haven't seen the direct contradictory nature. The regulations really serve one main purpose, and that is to protect the players. So I think everybody's thinking in the same way. It's not, one is going to absolutely contradict the other. There are some that are more prescriptive, some that are more suggestive, some that are more explicit, less explicit. But in general, I don't see them conflicting as much as it is. I think what we try to do is to, with the compliance team, keep a pulse on what's happening, influence where we can, not like political lobbying, but more like here's, I think what we're trying to accomplish and what our suggestion would be to sort of shape this. And then if you look across dozens or hundreds of regulatory bodies, how do you manage to a common set, the lowest common denominator, and then where you need to, you sort of build from that. And I think companies that take this more seriously, that are more progressive, that are, again, leaning into this topic, you really figure out how do you manage this stuff while you're navigating toward a best-in-class cybersecurity set of capabilities.
It sounds like reality in the gaming world, you've probably got best-in-class GRC compared to anything other than maybe banks or federal government, because of the complexity you've got to manage in one central place across multiple geos and multiple requirements that have nuance changes. It really sounds like that's an interesting part. Larry made an interesting comment going back to what you just said, which I think was interesting. He was talking about the fact we're all in it together is often a phrase, but actually very hard to implement. And that people who have made sites around it in communities, but they're not actually doing anything from it. I think you're right. I don't disagree. I think the reality is that things are starting to change. I think CrowdStrike was a big one, if I'm honest. CrowdStrike, the community rallied. I was one of them, and I bought CrowdStrike stock because I looked at it and I commented on some of their stuff. I thought they turned up to DEF CON and selected the best or the worst fail of the year award in the plug, so I can put that on live YouTube. And I think that was great. And I think that when you look at that, you look at SolarWinds recently as well, similarly again. I think we start by just being optimistic and being positive and being nice. Right? Like the same way that social media is divisive and the natural inherent person, what someone wants to criticize something they did without the context. The first thing I did when I saw CrowdStrike was, so I'm a CrowdStrike customer. Like, we think it's a good platform. It works.
It's a very interesting point. And I happen to have the privilege of having been at dinner with Michael Santonis the night that the world changed for him and for all of us, frankly, forever. And had a very similar reaction, as I'm getting calls from folks that, are you a CrowdStrike customer? As I'm sitting in a bar, unable to use my credit card, in the next morning, trying to fly somewhere and realizing that we were going through a pretty massive incident, not just a cyber event, but an IT event overall. But I had the very similar reaction. Members of my board and senior executives were saying, "Oh, thank God we're not a CrowdStrike customer." And I was like, I think that's the wrong way to look at this. I think CrowdStrike is leading the world from a tech standpoint. Absolutely has done more good in the world than bad, even though this was a tough set of lessons to learn. And then to your point, they are going to be and are already, I think, stronger and better because of it, and helping others far outside of the CrowdStrike world itself to recognize the importance of resilience and change control and phase testing and phased implementations and these kinds of things.
I mean, the automatic response was, look what happened. My automatic response was, do you see how good their post-breach analysis was? I was like, oh my days, like the fact they got to that level of detail that quickly. I was like, these guys, look, they made a mistake, right? Fine. But everything else in their house was in such immaculate order because of how quickly they were able to respond and the way in which they responded. We're just taking CrowdStrike as one instance. You could pick up multiples, right? SolarWinds is a great example where you've got one thing of being upheld about password policy. I'm like, if you've got the whole org apart from 17 people holding a password policy, you've done pretty damn well. Like it's pretty hard to get 100%. But anyway, Larry, I'll send you some resources. Send me a message at jake@jlbcyber.com. John Bell, send me a bunch of questions and I'll try and phase some of the questions into my next few podcasts because there is a lot of questions right there. A lot of it's interesting, but you find a strategic way to find it and probably the right guest to talk to on it because a lot of this is neural network type stuff. Jake, one last question before I let you go. I have a tradition of letting the last guest ask the last question of the next guest. I think you probably know Mandy Andrews from Elastic since you're part of the CISO Connect community. Great woman. I love her to bits. And her question for you was, what trend from your childhood should come back today and why?
Oh, gosh. I'm going to say mullets.
Oh, mate, I've got a little mullet going on. I'm right on trend for you.
my son, my 27-year-old son, who's the father of my one grandchild so far, actually has a sticker in the back of his truck that is about mullets, and he has the worst looking mullet, but I think it has to come back. The world needs more mullets, no question.
I'm with you. I've got it growing. You can't see it clear enough on this camera. Simon will attest to it. I have a mullet growing, and I'm with you.
But the reality is, I can't do any business up here. I just don't have much, but I can do the party in the back. That's definitely coming back.
Go for it. I will ask you afterwards when we're not public what your question is for my next guest, which is Adam Marilano next week. Jake, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you being with us. I think you've shared some great nuggets of wisdom. Is there anything else you'd like to share before you go?
No, thanks for the opportunity. My pleasure.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you all for listening. Thank you for your questions as ever. It's always great to talk about these things and to delve into people's backgrounds, past thoughts, opinions, loves, desires, and passions. If you have any more questions, you know how to reach me separately, or you can find Jake on LinkedIn as well and learn a bit more about him, who he is, and what makes him tick. But if not, then I will see you and speak to you next week. And thank you again for listening.